Hello everyone. Tonight we are seated around a campfire in a peaceful forest. It is pleasantly warm, the sun is setting, and soon the stars will light up above our heads, one by one. This is a good time to relax, listen to some stories, and explore a little bit of the abundant myths and legends from West Africa, from Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Mali, and more places. We have a lot to discover, so let's begin immediately with our first stories. They are about Anansi, a god and folktale character of the Akan people, including the Ashanti. We will talk about them later. But first, listen to this story. Anansi is a trickster god who knows all stories in the world. But it was not always the case. A very long time ago, a time that was well before the lives of the grandfathers of our grandfathers, there were no stories in the world. More exactly, all stories were the ownership of Nyame, he who knows and sees everything, the sky god. Nyame was a jealous god who would not share any of the stories. He wanted them all just for himself. And when something happened in the world, he was the only one able to see and remember this new story that he added to his treasure. Anansi was a minor god who often appeared as a spider, and he had a taste for tricks. But he was just one god among many, and his name was unknown to most. He wanted to be known and revered around the world, and so he made the project to acquire Nyame's stories and become the new keeper, the new owner of stories. He went to Nyame and asked if he could buy the stories from him. He insisted he was able to pay for them, but the sky god did not want to give up his stories and told Anansi that he would never be rich enough. As a matter of fact, several great kingdoms had already tried to buy the stories, and yet none of them had been able to afford them. Who was Anansi in comparison? Nothing, and so he would not succeed where the kingdoms had failed. But the little spider god was not one to renounce easily, and he insisted that Nyame named the price for the stories. The sky god laughed. He was entertained by the little god's ambitions or delusion, and so he fixed an extraordinarily high price. He would sell the stories only against 4 of the most dangerous creatures in the world. Anansi would have to bring him Onini the python, an enormous and lethal serpent, and also the Moboro hornets, a nest of furious and deadly insects, and on top of that, Osebo the leopard, a fast and ferocious beast, and finally, maybe the hardest and most dangerous of the 4, Moatia the fairy, who was very small but had terrifying powers. Anansi trembled at the idea of approaching any of the 4, but there was no way back. And to prove his bravery and seal the deal, he even added a fifth to the list. He would also bring his own mother, Yansia, for extra measure. Niamey accepted the offer and advised him to begin his journey. The sky god had no doubt that Anansi would fail in this unlikely quest, and that on top of keeping all the stories, he would also be entertained watching the little god fail. This would be a good story to add to his treasures, that he would keep only for himself, like the others. Anansi was not the strongest, nor the fastest, and certainly not the bravest, but he was smart, and if he was to succeed, that would be with schemes. And so, with this only weapon, he embarked on the quest. He went to his family and told them about his conversation with the sky god, and that, to begin with, he intended to capture Onini, the python. He asked his wife, Asso, for advice, and Asso advised him to cut the trunk from a palm tree and gather some creeper vines that could serve as rope. They would pretend to argue about Onini and make the python approach. They had thought about a solution to catch the monster. And so they went near the river where Onini was rumored to live. They pretended to argue about the length of the python's body. Anansi said the python was longer than the palm tree trunk, whereas Asso repeated it was impossible that the python would be so long. Onini heard them and approached, crawling between the trees. The python was enormous and terrifying, but he was curious about their argument, and when Anansi told him that Asso did not want to believe he was longer than the tree, the python was willing to prove he was really that big. Anansi pretended to suddenly have an idea. He told Onini that there was a palm tree trunk, and the python could easily prove he was longer by stretching himself beside it. Onini did so eagerly, and in fact he was a little bit longer than the trunk. But he had also fallen into a trap. Immediately, Anansi and Asso took the creeper vines and tied him up to the trunk in a stretched position that made him lose almost all his strength. The two now only had to deliver the trunk and the python to Niamey, the sky god, and so they did. On the way, Anansi mocked the python and informed him of his bargain with Niamey. The sky god was surprised Anansi had accomplished his first assignment, but he reminded him that he still had other challenges, and these ones would be harder. The next challenge was to capture the deadly Moboro hornets, a swarm of furious insects that no one dared to approach. The capture of one creature was one thing, but how to capture an entire swarm? Again, Anansi returned to Asso and asked his wife if she could help him come up with a plan. They talked for a long time, and a plan was designed. Anansi took a big gourd that he filled with fresh water, and he went looking for the hornets that generally stayed near a bush when they were not raiding other insects or innocent people. He soon found the bush and approached the hornets as close as he could, and he sprinkled some of his water at them, saving half of it. Then he quickly ran to a banana tree, cut a leaf, sprinkled it with the rest of the water, and covered his head with it. The hornets had been surprised by this absurd attack, and as soon as they had regrouped, they went looking for the one who had dared to sprinkle them with water. They found Anansi near the banana tree. It could only be him, because there was no one else nearby. But instead of escaping, Anansi showed them the banana leaf and told them it had rained, and the proof was that the banana leaf he had used to cover his head was all wet. Anansi then warned the hornets that the rain was dangerous for them, and that a quick rain like this one often announced a bigger rain. Maybe they should look for shelter. The hornets had to accept this logical explanation, and they thanked Anansi. But before they went, the little god showed them his gourd and offered them its protection. If they entered the gourd, surely they would all stay safe. The hornets accepted. They were not the smartest of creatures in the world, and they all entered the gourd one by one. Then all Anansi had to do was seal the mouth of the gourd, and the entire swarm was now his prisoner. Without waiting, he took the gourd full of hornets to Niamey, the sky god, and on the way, like Foronini the python, he taunted the hornets and told them about his plan to trade them for Niamey stories. The sky god accepted the hornets, but reminded Anansi that he still had other tasks left. Anansi returned home and informed Asso of his success. It was now time to plot against Osebo, the leopard. This was yet another challenge, because the leopard was as dangerous as the python or the hornets, because of its claws and teeth. But it was also incredibly fast. It could catch you or escape very easily, and it seemed the only way to safely capture the beast was to find it unconscious somehow. Again, Anansi and Asso discussed a plan, and they came up with one. Anansi went to the place where Osebo could normally be found. He dug a deep pit in the ground, wide and deep enough so that even Osebo would be unable to jump out of it. Then he decided it was enough for the first part of the plan. He covered the pit with twigs and leaves, and returned home, knowing that sooner or later the leopard would stumble into the pit. The night was coming. This was the time when the leopard went hunting, and he certainly didn't want to be anywhere near when the beast would start looking for prey. The night passed, and on the following morning, Anansi returned to the pit. As expected, Osebo the leopard had fallen into it. He feigned surprise and sympathy, and explained that he would be happy to help the leopard, but if he did, he was sure the beast would eat him. Osebo had to swear that he wouldn't harm Anansi. And thanks to this little act, Anansi gained his trust. So he accepted to help Osebo get out of the pit. He said he would put 2 long sticks inside the hole, and that the leopard would be able to climb them and get out. And so it was done. The leopard started climbing. But when he arrived near the surface, in a precarious position because he had to stay on the sticks, Anansi took a third stick and hit him in the head. The leopard fell back to the bottom of the pit, unconscious. And this time, Anansi could approach and tie him with rope. Then he raised the beast out of the pit and took Osebo to Niamey, the sky god. Again, he mocked his prisoner on the way and explained his bargain, and again, Niamey accepted Anansi's gift, the third of the 4 creatures he had to capture. Anansi returned home another time. The 4th and last creature on the list was also the most difficult and dangerous to catch. Moatia, the fairy. Anansi devised another plan. Moatia was a very small creature with wings. This made her able to hide and escape very easily. Actually, anyone trying to go on a hunt for the fairy had almost no chance to even find her. And she could also become invisible if she wished. And despite her small size, she could cast spells using her tiny arms. She could make you see things. So she was not only almost impossible to find, she could be very dangerous if someone, by miracle, achieved to find her. But any creature has its weak spot, and Anansi imagined a way to attract and neutralize the fairy without her even noticing. He carved a small doll in wood, an akua doll that young women used as a lucky charm when they hoped to conceive a child, or sometimes to ensure the attractiveness of the child they carried. Next, Anansi gathered the sap out of a gum tree and covered the little doll with it until it became very sticky. And finally, he prepared mashed yams and cooked it with just enough spices and herbs to make it smell delicious. His trap was now almost ready. He headed off to the land of the fairies and placed the doll in front of a tree where fairies were known to often congregate. In front of the doll, he put a little basin with mashed yams, and he turned to his spider form to create some of its silk, a single thread, so thin that it was invisible. Then he went to hide behind the tree, with the silk thread connected to the neck of the doll. The trap was ready, and so he waited. Soon, the fairy was attracted by the delicious smell of mashed yams and cautiously approached the doll. The doll was just the size of a fairy. Fairies came in all sorts of shapes and colors, and this was the place where fairies congregated, so Moatia assumed that the doll was one of her sisters, even though it looked funny for a fairy. Fairies could be aggressive and mean-spirited with other species, but between them they had their code of honor and politeness. So Moatia asked the doll if she could have some of its mashed yams. Anansi moved the thread a little bit, so that it seemed the akua doll was nodding in approval. Excited by what she took for the doll's invitation to eat, the fairy took what was in the basin and ate everything. When she was finished, she thanked the doll. But this time, Anansi did not move the thread at all, and the doll stayed perfectly still. Not acknowledging the gratitude of a guest was a serious offense, and it seemed the doll was now completely ignoring the fairy, which made it worse. This called for retribution, and so Moatia slapped the doll in the face. But her tiny hand stayed stuck to the doll. Surprised and furious, the fairy tried to slap her again with her remaining hand, only to stick it to the doll too. And then she tried to bludgeon the doll with the rest of her body, certain that this time the doll would finally react. But, of course, the fairy only stuck her entire body to the gum that covered the doll. At this moment, Anansi emerged from hiding and used the rest of the string he had tied to the doll to firmly bind Moatia. Unable to use her arms, she could not cast any spell, and becoming invisible would not help her now that she was tied to the doll. Anansi had captured the fairy, and he quickly left the fairy's wood to return home. This was the fourth and last creature he had to capture. He also asked his mother to accompany him, and together they went to Niamey, the sky god, to claim the prize, all the stories in the world. Niamey accepted both of them, Moatia the fairy, and Yansia the mother. He was thoroughly impressed at this success, and while he regretted to have promised his treasure of stories, there was no way back. The sky god could not break his word. Niamey announced that from this moment on, Anansi would be the owner of all stories, and that stories may now be disseminated, retold, transmitted from parents to children, and from children to their children. This is how, thanks to his tricks, Anansi triumphed and became the knower of all stories. We have a lot more to discover, but before I tell you another Anansi story, because there are many, many more, take a moment to relax and don't hesitate to close your eyes. You can fall asleep at any time. It doesn't matter, there are timestamps on your screen and in the comment pinned under this video, should you want to navigate between stories or return later. These stories will also soon be on Spotify, Apple Music and other audio streaming sites. There are already dozens to discover there, including one about the Great Library of Alexandria that is exclusive to audio streaming services. And another option to listen to everything, download audios and videos, and also support this channel and keep it free of ad breaks and sponsors, is to become one of the sponsors. You can do that on Patreon and contribute this way to keep me going. There is a link in the pinned comment and in the description box. Now, let's return to Anansi with another shorter story. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about Akan and Ashanti cultures. And we will travel to others of the dozens of peoples that live across West Africa. Anansi is generally well liked, sometimes a bit feared. But apart from the time when he managed to become the owner of stories, his tricks generally fail, and he falls prey to his own machinations, reminding that tricks are a double-edged sword and that immoral behavior often doesn't pay. Here is an example of that. There was a time when Anansi lived in a village hit by famine and drought. Food was scarce. Anansi had to support his wife, Aso, and his children. So he tried to figure out a way to survive. In the same village, there was a witch called Five. But the witch hated her name, so much so that she had cast a spell. If anyone said her name out loud, they would fall asleep for a year. Anansi saw an opportunity. He would trick others into saying her name. They would fall asleep, and he would eat them with his spider family. He asked Aso to gather all the food they had left, and he made 5 piles out of it. He sat on one pile, and soon a rabbit passed nearby, looking for food like everyone. He called the rabbit and asked him if he wanted some food for his children. He told him that if he was able to tell how many piles of food there were, then he could have one of them, one of the piles. The rabbit started to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as soon as he said 5, he fell asleep. Anansi took the rabbit to his wife, who cooked it, and the whole family could eat this day. But the food soon ran out, and again Anansi used his trick. A squirrel passed. He offered one of the piles if the squirrel could say how many there were. And again the little animal fell asleep saying 5, and the family had food to eat. When food ran out again, Anansi put the 5 piles in front of his house, and this time a goose passed by. The rabbit and the squirrel were not famous for their intelligence, but the goose was not that naive. Anansi offered it to count the piles, but instead of counting from 1 to 5, the goose said 1, 2, 3, 4, and the pile you are sitting on. Anansi said no, this was not the way to count, and that in order to get one of the piles, the goose had to do it right. The goose smiled and tried again. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the one pile you're sitting on. Anansi was becoming hungry, and he thought the goose was the stupidest of all animals. So he asked to count again, but there was nothing to do. The goose would count 1, 2, 3, 4, and the one you're sitting on. Anansi lost all patience, and as any hungry person, he made a mistake. He explained the goose it was supposed to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As soon as he said 5, he fell asleep. The goose took the 5 piles of food, and this day the goose family could eat as much as they wanted. I told you Anansi was an Akan character. The Akan are a group of peoples who now live primarily in Ghana and Ivory Coast. It is believed that they migrated to their current location from the Sahara Desert around the 11th century. They settled in a more humid region covered with forests. But before this migration, their oral tradition and ethnology suggest that they came from the east of Africa. In any case, once they had settled in what is now Ghana and Ivory Coast, they emerged between the 15th and the 19th centuries as gold miners and traders. The region where they lived had very rich deposits, and the gold was sold through trade routes across the Sahara Desert to the east toward the rest of Africa, and on the coast to European traders who arrived in bigger and bigger numbers looking for slaves and gold. The Akan were not a single people or state. There are many different peoples, but they are culturally related by their languages, and they share similar ethnic roots. Eventually, the Ashanti Empire emerged at the beginning of the 18th century. The Ashanti are one Akan people, but there were several others within the frontiers of this state, which was centered on modern Ghana, but also included parts of Togo and Ivory Coast. It lasted until the early 20th century, when it fell to European colonization. But before this happened, Akan culture had traveled with slave ships across the Atlantic to the West Indies, for example to Jamaica, to Suriname, to the United States, and their legends and beliefs traveled with them. This is why Anansi is no stranger to America. Akan culture, rites, and beliefs was one of the big influences that shaped African communities in the Americas. There are Anansi stories that were born or transformed enough in America to become part of the original folklore of Jamaica, for example, or Haiti. Anansi is just the most prominent of a very large and complicated pantheon of gods, of demigods, of spirits, all sorts of mythological creatures that were sometimes specific to certain West African ethnicities, or sometimes shared between different peoples. North of Ghana and Ivory Coast, in the central plateau region of Mali, live the Dogons, another ethnic group. And they have an extraordinary creation myth. So let's discover it. Before the earth and the sky existed, when there was no day, no night, no water and no plants, no men and no animals, there was only Amma, the one God. Amma himself was not material. If anyone had been there, they still wouldn't have been able to see or touch him. Amma was pure thought, and with thoughts and signs, Amma began to trace the plan of the universe. As any action, thing, or speech is preceded by thought, Amma created 266 different signs, the same number of signs as there are days in a pregnancy. But thought and concepts advanced only through trial and error. Amma created a first universe, but this first attempt lacked the harmony and the beauty he wanted to conceive. So he unmade it, and only salvaged the four elements he had created with this first world: water, air, earth, and fire, that he liked and reused in his second attempt. To create a truly harmonious and beautiful world, Amma thought that everything should have a counterpart. He used some of the earth and the water he had created before to make small balls, and he started modeling them to create bodies and beings. He created the sun as a white pottery circled with a spiral of red copper, and its counterpart, the moon, as another white pottery circled with a spiral of white copper. He also needed a counterpart for himself, and because he lived in the sky, a world of air and fire, he conceived a partner that would live under him, a partner of earth and water, our land. This duality was harmonious, and he liked it. It was so perfect that it could create life if he fertilized the earth, and he did. But the result of this union was imperfect, because a single son was born from it, and singularity, the absence of counterpart, brought chaos. This son, Urugu, introduced disorder into the world. He was male with no female counterpart, and this would forever disturb the harmony and threaten to undo the perfection of the Creator God's creations. Urugu escaped and still lives among us. He is the force behind all chaotic events, from disorderly conducts in humans to natural disasters. But Amma knew that through trial and error, he could keep advancing in his creation. And so he fathered another being with his partner, the earth. And this time, he reached perfection. The earth gave birth to Nomo, an androgynous being that was at the same time male and female. Nomo served as the model for future birth. Using more earth, Amma created humans, and they were all given two souls, one male and one female, two principles corresponding to two different persons inside each human being. But Nomo also saw that the life of humans could not easily accommodate the coexistence of these two principles inside each person. And so, to overcome this duality that made life complicated, boys would become men and get rid of their female principle when reaching adulthood, whereas girls would become women and get rid of their male principle. But Urugu, the imperfect first son, was out in the world, and it was now said that imperfection and disorder would always be a part of it. There would be forever conflicts in the heart of each individual between opposite principles, male and female, hope and fear, selfishness and altruism, violence and softness, honesty and treachery. Despite the passage to adulthood, no one can entirely get rid of this double principle that is at the heart of our beings. Perfection and harmony were the goals, the driving principles of the creation of our world, and this is why we understand them as concepts, we recognize them. And the best part of us tends to respect these principles, to be drawn to them. But our inner conflicts and the existence of Urugu, the principle of disorder, make this perfection unreachable. However, on a larger scale, chaos and order also form a duality. Urugu and Nomo could be seen as two opposite sides, and it is in this troubled world, but made stable by this never-ending duality, that we are called to live. The Dogons are famous for their art and the architecture of some of their villages that are built on defensive positions on cliffs, because they were exposed to religious and ethnic persecutions for centuries. But this also cemented their identity within the mosaic of peoples in West Africa. Their art, especially their sculptures on wood, is absolutely unique, and in this culture, sculptures are given an important symbolic meaning. They are powerful and respected artifacts that are not made to be displayed or to decorate the outside of houses. The sculptures are hidden from the public eye within the houses of families or in sanctuaries. Now, let's move to the southwest of Nigeria, the main center of populations of the Yoruba people. As you may know, Nigeria has dozens of ethnicities and even hundreds of languages. The largest ethnic group are the Hausa, that make about 30% of its population. The Yoruba are the second or third largest, near the Igbo, with about 15% each. That is still 40 million Yoruba living in Nigeria, mainly in the southwest of the country. And to a lesser extent, they are also present in Benin, Ghana, and Togo. Their traditional religious and spiritual concepts have traveled very far. I told you before about this phenomenon with the Ashanti, the Akan in general. Yoruba religion is also the basis for a number of religions and myths in the New World, including Santería, which originated in Cuba and mixes Yoruba and Catholic faith with Spiritism, or Brazilian religions like Umbanda or Candomblé, which also emerged from the mix of Yoruba and Catholic beliefs. Haitian Vodou also has a strong Yoruba component. Like the figure of Anansi, all the beliefs traveled the Atlantic and lived on in slaves or recently emancipated communities from the 17th to the 19th century. But returning to Africa, the Yoruba religion has an extensive cosmology, a very vast pantheon, and hundreds of entities called the Orishas. They could be called deities, even though they are generally far from perfect, but more than deities, they are manifestations of the supreme, all-encompassing being, Olodumare. But they also have human traits that make them relatable, and they have control over specific elements of nature. Over generations and generations of oral tradition, the Yoruba cosmology, legends, and folk tales has become a gigantic body of stories. They exist in multiple versions, and we can only scratch the surface of this tonight. I'll come back to the Orisha in a minute. But first, let's begin with one of the Yoruba stories about how life was created on Earth. Long ago, before there were any people in the world, all life existed only in the sky. Olodumare, the all-encompassing being who has no limit, no gender, and all power, lived in the sky. And with Olodumare lived many, many Orishas. They all lived around a young baobab tree. The Orishas could find everything they needed for their lives within their reach, and in fact they all wore beautiful clothes and gold jewelry. Olodumare told them that the entire sky was theirs to explore, but all the Orishas were content to stay near the baobab tree and uninterested in exploring their world. All but one. This curious Orisha was Obatala. Like all Orishas, male and female, he had certain powers, but he wanted to put them to use instead of just living blissfully by the baobab tree. Obatala was the singular Orisha that would bring changes to the world. As he pondered what to do, he looked far down through the mists below the sky. And as he looked and descended as much as he could to see better, he began to realize that there was a vast, empty ocean below the mist. An immense expanse of water, with no earth. There were no islands, no coastlines, and even less life in it. Obatala went to Olodumare and asked to let him make something solid in the waters below. This way there could be beings that himself and the other Orishas could help with their powers, giving them a purpose. Olodumare was touched by Obatala's desire to do something constructive and creative, instead of just enjoying a purposeless life around the baobab tree. And so the Supreme Being agreed to send Obatala to the watery world below. Obatala had to prepare for his mission. He went to Orumila, the Orisha who could know the future, and he asked Orumila what he should bring along. Orumila used his powers to see the threads of the future. He sprinkled powder of baobab roots on a sacred tray and observed the patterns, repeating the operation 8 times until he had sufficient vision of what the future could be like. And finally, he told Obatala to prepare a long chain of gold and to gather sand as much as he could, and also palm nuts and maize and all the seeds he could find. And finally, to bring along the sacred egg that carried the personalities of all the Orishas. That secret egg was kept between the roots of the baobab tree. Obatala went to his fellow Orishas and asked them all for their gold. They all gave him all the gold they had. He took all the gold to the goldsmith of the Orishas and had the jewelry turned into a long chain that ended with a hook. He also gathered all the sand in the sky, palm nuts, maize and other seeds, everything he could find around the baobab tree, and with all this equipment, he hooked the chain into the sky and started to climb down. The watery world was very, very far from the baobab tree, and for 7 days he went down and down, until finally he reached the end of the chain. The water was just under him, but he was unsure what to do, and so he looked and listened for any clue. Finally, he heard the voice of Orumila, the seer, who could also communicate at a distance, and Orumila called him to use the sand he was carrying. Obatala poured the sand into the water below, and to his surprise, the sand solidified to make a vast, solid land. And as this vast, flat land formed, the sacred egg he was carrying suddenly cracked. From it flew a sacred bird, Sankofa, the bird bearing the spirits of all the Orishas. Sankofa multiplied into as many birds as there were Orishas, and there are more than anyone could imagine. And all the birds flew like a storm above the flat land, blowing the sand to make dunes and hills and mountains, and also plains and flatlands, giving this land character, just as the Orishas themselves have character. The diversity, the multiplicity of Orishas shaped the land into a multiplicity of landscapes. As there was now solid earth below him, Obatala let go of the chain and dropped to this new land that he called Ife, the place that divides the waters. He began to explore this world, and as he explored, he scattered the seeds he had brought, and as he walked, the seeds began to grow behind him, so that the land turned green in his wake. After walking a long time, Obatala grew thirsty, and he stopped at a small pond to drink. But as he bent over the water, he saw his reflection, and he was pleased. Orishas had no mirrors, and they never saw their reflection. They were unaware of their appearance. He took some clay from the edge of the pond and began to mold it into the shape he had seen in the reflection. He finished that one and began another and yet another, and before long he had made many of these bodies from the dark clay at the pond side. Olodumare had watched this, and he liked what Obatala had been making. So he gathered gases from the space beyond the sky and sparked them into an explosion, forming the largest fireball the world had ever seen. He sent that fireball to the land, to Ife, where it dried the lands that were still wet and began to bake the clay figures that Obatala had made. Olodumare then blew his breath of life across Ife, and the figures slowly came to life. The first people of Ife had appeared, and the saga of mankind could now begin. The beliefs of the Yoruba faith were passed down orally for generations and were put into writing only recently, since the 19th century. So there are multiple versions of the same stories, and the names can be different. Olodumare is also known as Olorun or Olofin, but it is the same entity that at the same time created the universe and is the universe. Everything else descends from him, and just under him are the Orishas, which are manifestations of him. But the Orishas are not flawless or all-powerful. They have personalities, tastes, interests, and specific powers. They are said to be uncountable because there are many. But in stories, 20 to 30 Orishas regularly come back. Orishas are relatable, much more than Olodumare, which is too far away from human affairs and the problems of the mortals to make contact. But through the Orishas, there are figures to turn to, and because the Orishas are emanations of Olodumare, every prayer to an Orisha reaches the Supreme Being. The Orishas are like gods in a sense, but a comparison has also been made with Catholic saints, and actually religions in America that mixed Yoruba and Catholic influences tend to establish an equivalence or a system of correspondence between them. There are 6 or 7 Orishas that are particularly popular and revered. They include Obatala, that we just talked about in the story. Obatala is a deity of creation and the protector of the weak and disabled, a very benevolent figure to which humans owe their creation. There are also Esu, the messenger god, who presides over crossroads, doorways and travels. There's Ogun, the patron of metallurgy and healing, Shango, the god of fire, thunder and war, Oya, the goddess of transformation and rebirth, who guards the dead, Oshun, the goddess of love and fertility, Yemaya, the protector of all women and water. These Orishas form a kind of pantheon, if we want to compare it with polytheistic religions, and the quantity of stories that pitch Orishas against each other, the love stories between them, sometimes their rebellions against Olodumare that they find too old to rule the world. These are abundant and a source of inspiration for myth. With all their traits and the development of their personality, they remind a lot of Greek gods from Greek and Roman classical literature. Oshun, the Orisha of love, can be spiteful. Shango, the Orisha of war and fire, is impatient. Esu, the messenger god, is deceitful. But a major difference with other cosmologies is that the Orishas are also manifestations of a much more powerful being, Olodumare, and they can always be trusted to deliver the messages of mortals to the Supreme Being. They are not that separated from the King of Gods in a sense. Orishas understand human weaknesses, fears, and aspirations, because men were made to their image, and men need them, since this world is conflictual and often painful. But how did it come to be like this, since Obatala formed the first humans with clays, and Olodumare gave them the breath of life? Let's finish with one last story that explains this. After the earth was created and populated, there were no reasons for conflicts to happen, and every human was equal and free. No one wanted for anything, as the earth provided for all, and in equal part. But as time went on, people began to complain about this situation. If everyone had everything they needed, and if everyone was equal, no one could be any different from their neighbor, and they had no goals to strive for. They complained loudly to Olodumare, and their cries were delivered by Esu, the messenger Orisha, who played his role as intermediary. Back and forth, Esu went between Olodumare and the people, trying to reason with humanity. They had all they needed in the world, their desires were met, and no one went hungry. But the people argued that one of their desires was not met. They wanted differentiation, and they wanted goals in their lives. They rejected equality. Olodumare let them know that he could grant their wishes, but that once the change would be made, it could never be reversed. But still, people insisted that equality made life pointless, and they demanded change. So Olodumare gave them what they wanted. Afterward, the world changed dramatically indeed. Jealousy, envy came into people's relations. The poor began to rob the rich, and the rich began to enact laws against the poor. Resources were gathered and defended by one people against another, and there was want and starvation and fear of loss. This is how war came to the world, and with it, sometimes people lost everything. The people realized their mistake and were sorry for having questioned the plan of the Supreme Being. But they had received exactly what they asked for, and would have to live with it now. To bring support and comfort, or the strength to prevail in this now unequal world, remained only the Orishas to pray to, either to win or to accept defeat and unfulfilled expectations. The Orishas understand the aspiration to differentiation and inequality because they are partly like us. They also have their wants, their ambitions, and the very human desire to rise above others. And yet, they are also aware that this is destructive and probably creates more pain and disappointment than good. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. I picked a few stories from Ashanti, Dogon, and Yoruba traditions, but we really just scratched the surface. There are many more peoples and many more stories in West Africa. But this is all for tonight, so you can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library. The night is still young, and the sweet sound of the campfire will accompany you for a little while. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.